Sehr geehrte Frau Bundeskanzlerin, sehr geehrte Frau
Federal
Adichie,
Chancellor, Mrs.
sehr geehrte
Adichie,
Frau Ministerin, sehr geehrter
Minister,
Herr Oberbürgermeister,
Mayor,
sehr geehrte Frau Meckel, sehr geehrte Frau
Ms.
Steinacker,
Meckel, Ms. Steinacker,
liebe Vertreterinnen und Vertreter
dear
aus Politik,
representatives
Kultur,
from
Wirtschaft und
politics,
Verwaltung,
culture, the
sehr
business
verehrtes
community and
Publikum
administrations.
hier im Saal,
Dear
und im
audience
Livestream zu
here
Hause an
in
Ihren
this room,
Rechnern.
and ladies and gentlemen
Herzlich
on your,
willkommen im Düsseldorfer
at your
Schauspielhaus.
screens at home for the live stream. Warm welcome
ein
to
großes
the
Ereignis und
Düsseldorf
eine außerordentliche
Schauspielhaus.
Ehre,
It is a big
Sie
event
heute zu
and
dieser
it
wirklich
is a
besonderen
great honor
Veranstaltung
to
begrüßen
be
zu dürfen.
welcoming you here
Wir haben
today.
uns schon sehr lange darauf gefreut.
We have been looking
ebenso
forward
lange
to this
diese
event for a very
Veranstaltung
long
gebannt.
time, and we have been fearing
Ursprünglich
that
sollte
this
sie
event
bereits
could not go ahead for a very
2020
long time.
das Festival
It was
Theater der
originally
Welt
planned
eröffnen.
for 2020
Wir sind
as an
allen
introduction to
Beteiligten
our festival
dankbar,
Theater of
dass
the
Sie immer wieder
World.
signalisiert
We
haben,
are very
dass Ihnen diese
grateful to
Begegnung so wichtig
all
ist,
of you who are
dass sie auf jeden Fall
participating, that you have
stattfinden wird.
always told us that you find it so important that you will go ahead with it.
Für uns hier am gerade neu
For
sanierten
us
Düsseldorfer
here
Schauspielhaus
in the just recently
die Eröffnung der
refurbished
Spielzeit
Düsseldorf
nach einer
Schauspielhaus,
sehr langen Pause.
this is the start of our
Fast
season
fühlt es
after a
sich wie ein
very long
Neustart
break.
an.
It nearly feels like a
Ein
new
wenig wie die
start,
Neuerfindung
a little
dessen,
bit like
was wir sehr lange als
reinventing
selbstverständlich betrachtet
what
haben.
we've taken for granted for a very long time, and its vulnerability, but also its importance, has become so clear to us in the past few months, very painfully, when we missed our audience and the stage. A theater as a place for reflection, for discussion, is urgently required, will also, at the same time, however, have to redefine itself. We see this as an opportunity. Today, it is not a matter of fact to be able to welcome international guests such as Ms. Adichie. So it's wonderful to have you here and that you have taken the trouble to travel here from Lagos to Düsseldorf. A very warm welcome once again to you here to Düsseldorf, Mrs. Adichie.
Wir befinden uns in einer politischen Landschaft, in der große
We
fundamentale
are in a
Fragen nach der Zukunft
political
diskutiert
landscape where fundamental questions are being discussed currently, where, however, the challenges of the present always take up a lot of room. How do we live? How do we want to live? Federal Chancellor, Madam Chancellor, you, as of only very few people in the past few years, have used the opportunity to look at and analyze global problems and questions and to develop perspectives. Your presence here with us today is a special moment for us all. We're very much aware of that. A very warm welcome, Madam Chancellor.
Besonders erwähnt werden muss, die Idee
I
und
would
Initiative zu
also
dem
like
Gespräch
to particularly
verdanken wir
mention
Frau
that
Professor
the
Dr. Miriam
idea
Meckel
of this
und Frau
event goes
Dr.
back
Léa
to Professor
Steinacker.
Miriam Meckel and Dr. Léa Steinacker.
Sie haben die ungewöhnliche Konstellation und den
They
thematischen
have
Rahmen gesetzt.
chosen this unusual constellation for the discussion and the unusual framework. We're curious about the talk and with these two very important voices from our cultural and political presence and current situations, looking at perspectives and changes of perspectives. Now I would like to welcome our two facilitators for this evening, our two hosts, Miriam Meckel and Léa Steinacker. Both are co-founders and managing directors of ADA Learning GmbH, one of the most exciting business startups in professional further education and training. And it is in this function that they reflect and represent what they teach others: curiosity for new technologies, enthusiasm to use these technologies for building a better society. You are really constructing our future. We're very pleased that they've been able to come here today and make this event possible. We're looking forward to the conversation. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We cordially welcome you, dear guests, to this unusual conversation, this unusual evening. It is unusual. And as we've just heard by the director, Wilfried Schulz, we have invited a special, very outstanding two women here tonight. We are welcoming once again the Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Nigerian writer and publicist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Very warm welcome to you. The constellation for this conversation may have come as a surprise to some of you, and many have been surprised by it. We found when Mrs. Adichie last Sunday posted this event on Instagram, there were hundreds of enthused and very positive comments, one of which was, "Is the world even ready? Can't wait." And we thought, yes, we think that the world is ready for it. And as Mr. Schulz has just described, we've had to wait because of this pandemic ever since May 2020. But it's all the more pleasing to have the event here tonight. We're looking forward to this meeting, and we are ready for it, and I hope that you are too. Yes, we're ready and we're curious.
The commonalities and the differences of these two women who will actually meet for the very first time here on stage tonight at the Schauspielhaus in Düsseldorf. And actually one of these commonalities is the reason for our idea to even ask the two of them to have this dialogue in the first place. In 2009, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie gave a very successful TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. And in it, she very vividly describes how we as humans tend to reduce others and sometimes even ourselves to a single narrative, which basically does not really do justice to the whole picture of who we are. In fact, she said, and I quote, "The consequence of the single story is this: it robs us of our dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar." And her work has now been translated into over 30 languages. It has sold millions of copies worldwide and garnered multiple literary prizes. And we're very happy to have you here tonight.
Yeah. The danger of a single story, die Gefahr, alles Mögliche in einer
The danger of a single story, the danger to reduce everything to a single narrative is something that we would like to discuss here today, because we can see, all of us, I think, that we live in times when we spend more energy on cementing differences rather than interesting ourselves for others, to see and to be curious about the other, what they have, new ideas, inspiration and incentives. And we also live in times when curiosity is undermined in debate, and where the social media also make a contribution to the fact that diversity in opinions is turned into online battle waging, and we're all overwrought by it. And this is one of the many topics that we would like to discuss here today. In order to safeguard pluralism and ambiguity, we must also be able to come to terms with this ambiguity, and this can't be done with a single story. And we speak many languages here as well here today.
So let's please welcome here on stage German Chancellor Angela Merkel and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. to Miriam.
Wir haben es gerade schon gesagt, wir werden in den Sprachen wechseln.
We've just said it, we will speak German and English so that you will be hearing both languages here. There is simultaneous interpretation and the live stream is also in the two languages, also the recording, so nobody will miss out on anything. So let's start. Madam Chancellor, let me start with you. In 2017, you stood for the fourth time as Federal Chancellor, and also to avoid a democratic limbo in the West from happening. The New York Times at the time called you the liberal West's last defender. When you look back at this today, what do you think? I mean, were you really the last defender of the Free West?
Well, of course not. You know, I've just listened to the fact that people tend to have the single story, the single narrative, and I don't want to give in to that temptation. I've always stood up for liberal democratic values, and I was delighted to be able to work in a free democratic society also as the Federal Chancellor. But one ought to be very careful not to overestimate one's own weight and importance. I think there are many people out there who are committed to democracy. I have to apologize. I'm engaging in multitasking just now. Can you, step down sometime after the 31st of September with a quiet conscience and peace of mind? Yes. As I see, I have made my contribution. And those who haven't understood by now will not understand after the next 4 years.
Because I think we've had some technical issues. I'm so sorry with your translation. So Chancellor Merkel just said that she actually feels quite okay leaving office now. After 16 years of service, she really thinks that she has paid her dues. And despite the, I think, global situation right now, she feels quite okay. So let me turn that question to you, considering that Chancellor Merkel is leaving office soon. We have just watched, let's have a look at the global world affairs tableau. We have just watched the stunning US withdrawal in Afghanistan. We can see China is striving for global domination. When we look to Ethiopia, Prime Minister and Nobel Peace Prize winner Aiby Ahmed is waging war against Northern Eritrea. Do you still have hope for a peaceful, liberal world order, considering that this lady is now leaving office?
Can I just say I'm really happy to be here. I'm not usually nervous about public things, but I felt quite nervous about meeting Madam Chancellor because I have admired her for a long time. And if she's okay with leaving, I'm not okay with her leaving. Because I'm worried about what will happen to Europe. I'm worried that Europe will fall apart because she won't be there to hold things together. But I think in terms of feeling hopeful about the world order, I think if we take a long-term historical view, there is reason to hope. I think the world has survived just really many political catastrophes. So I think there's reason to be hopeful, but in a way that's very cautious. But it also, I think, requires political will. I really think, I did say I would be calm. I really think that there's a certain failure of leadership in many parts of the world, and there's much more that could be done that hasn't been done. In other words, I think my point is that many of the things going on today are not inevitable. They did not have to happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you're in the creative arts, right? In your field of literature, do you think that art can also be a form of peacemaking, or at least a contribution to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, I think art matters because art is beautiful and feeds our soul. But I think it can also have political significance. Even just storytelling, right? I think can move people to act in ways. So I do think that yes, it can make a difference.
Wenn wir noch mal einen Moment bei der Frage
if we were to just stay for a moment with the future of liberal democracy, Mrs. Adichie expressed a cautious sense of hope. She doesn't want you to leave, Madam Chancellor, but she still has a sense of hope. But there seems to be something that is inbuilt in liberal democracy that is not simple in nature. I looked at the quote from the former judge at the Constitutional Court, Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförder, who said that the liberal secularized state was based on preconditions that it could not guarantee. Now take this year, 2021, and look at that statement. Do you think that there is a contradiction between democracy and liberal approaches? If we need one thing, we also have to restrict the other. Aren't we always calling into question or endangering a bit of what we are aiming for? No, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. You mentioned Mr. Böckenförder and quoted him, the former judge at the Federal Constitutional Court. I interpret that somewhat differently from you. I understand it to mean that if we want to preserve democracy, we need much more than politics. What we need is what Mrs. Adichie mentioned, culture. We need a philosophical view of the world. We need the contribution of religions. We need history. Where do we come from? Where do we want to go? And if all of that is not flourishing, then it is often extremely difficult to keep a society together and to create a feeling of belonging together with its parts of this approach. We cannot command history. We cannot instruct people to abide by the laws. We cannot force them to act in a charitable capacity. You tend to do that because you have a certain view of the world. Politics and politicians can perhaps prepare the ground and foster that climate by pursuing the right political approaches, but it is nothing you can force to come into being. If people decide all of a sudden that they will no longer to abide by the rules of the road, then we won't be able to turn all members of society into policemen. So in a way, rule of law and a constitutional state is based on people accepting it, and that's something that every generation has to learn afresh. When you look back at the many, many years you spent in office, did you notice a change with respect to the degree of acceptance? Well, I do believe that the secularization of our societies has had consequences. The diversity of media and what they have to offer has had a changing effect on our societies. When I look back to my early years as a child, we tended to come together for certain occasions. And we talked in the office about what we had been watching on television the evening before. This has changed because each and everyone watches whatever he or she is happy to watch. But I think we will find new ways to tackle these news developments. In the old days when we did not have broadcasting services, they could only communicate directly. And that is something that we experienced together. Then the change came, we adapted. Now the diversity, the tremendous offer of media, false information, disinformation, fake news, people hiding in their bubbles, not being willing to listen to other views and opinions. These are all new phenomena, and they change societies. And we have to learn and to work time and again how we can use these positive and, well, generally new changes. Yeah, please feel free to applaud.
Do you see changes in how people turn their liberties they gained by democracy against democracy? How the challenge is becoming bigger to fight for keeping democracy up and vivid?
I'm not sure what that question means.
I mean, that we gain a lot of liberties in a democratic state, and so we can have the freedom of expression, we can even ignore laws if we will be punished for that, but we can do a lot of things. And at the moment, it seems that people kind of are less acceptant of the democratic system in some parts of the world than they might have been years before. Really? But you can contradict to me.
Do you have any examples?
Well, I think in Germany we have the situation that we have a far-right party that has developed, the AfD, we talked about that yesterday, that has developed quite vividly during some years, and also in Eastern Europe we have a few examples if we look at towards Hungary, Poland.
But I mean, I guess for me the question is that a reaction to democracy? Is it that people suddenly said, we have too many rights, therefore we want to go back to repression? I don't think so. I think that there is what people call is populism, which I find to be a very strange word for what it actually represents. But there's populism that's sweeping across Europe, and actually was in the US under the former president, and which is, I think, quite illiberal. I wonder if it's a response to a kind of discontent that people have. And so it's easy for politicians to, not all politicians, some are better than others. It's easy for them, I think, to manipulate people's discontent and people's fears, and to then say to them, the answer is to close yourselves up. But that's not the answer. I mean, obviously, I'm a believer in freedom and democracy, but I don't think that it's necessarily a perfect system. And so then, of course, problems come, but the question then becomes, how does one deal with them? And what I've felt just watching the US, for example, because it's my second home after Nigeria, is that we need to have an educated and informed electorate. Otherwise, it's very easy to manipulate people. And I was thinking about what Madam Chancellor said about how we're all in our bubbles now. And while I think social media largely can be a good thing, it can also be very dangerous in keeping us from truth. I think that there's some platforms, and I will not name them, which thrive on conflict. And so people go on these platforms, and the goal is conflict, and the goal is to misinform, and the goal is to spread misinformation, and I think it's so dangerous. Now, I make these complaints, and I don't quite know what the answer is. In other words, how do we get to make sure that we have an informed electorate? How do we make sure that people actually know the truth about positions of people running for office, about the economic state of things in a country, that sort of thing, just basic information that people need so that they can vote properly. I really think that's very important. And social media can be very dangerous to that. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I was saying to Léa that I'm worried about sounding like my cantankerous old uncle in my hometown who thinks that everything modern is terrible. I certainly don't think so, but I just feel that we need to be a bit more circumspect about how we consume social media in terms of news. So what I say to young people is, do not get your news from TikTok. Right? Read an actual newspaper.
Yeah. I think you don't need to be worried about being a cantankerous old uncle. I think you're just opinionated, which is wonderful. Let's actually stick to politics in the countries that you know very well. You just mentioned the US. You live there part-time. You're obviously from Nigeria. You are very closely engaged and involved in the political and cultural discourse of both countries. Can you help us understand a bit more? How do you see how culture influences both styles of democracy in Nigeria and in the US?
Oh, I'm not sure we have a democracy in Nigeria. I think we have a democracy in name, but I'm not sure that we have a democracy in Nigeria. We have a government that has been, just really illiberal about the freedom of journalism, for example. And so I'm not sure that I would, in fact, call it a democracy. I would call it an ostensible democracy. In the US, what they had before this present president, I do not think was democracy either. Now I think it is, mostly. But I think maybe the difference is that Nigerian politics is not really ideological. Our parties are not ideological platforms in the way that the US is. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think that in the US, the ideological divide has become so extreme that in some ways I think common sense has been lost. And so now the whole idea is if the Democrats bring up anything, the goal of the Republicans is to say no. And in some ways vice versa as well. And that kind of ideological divide just really worries me. And so sometimes I think, yeah, in Nigeria the parties are they're kind of platforms for patronage. They're not really about ideology. So the answer is somewhere in the middle, I think.
Frau Bundeskanzlerin, Frau Adichie hat in ihrem TED-Talk damals gesagt,
Madam Chancellor, Ms. Adichie said in her TED Talk, power is the ability to not only tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. You call this election campaigning in Germany, don't you?
Nein, das würde ich jetzt
No. I wouldn't necessarily say that that was the case, but I'll have to think about what you actually mean. Well, of course, power is also about implementing what one wishes for by elected people. But if I may come back to what you said earlier, our democracy in Germany is different from the democracy in America. We don't have a rigid two-party system where, the members of one party look at the members of another party with a high level of skepticism, as is the case in America, where they often don't even engage in exchanges. Whereas we have the variety of different constellations that is possible. Take a look at the governments at the level of the individual states of the Federal Republic of Germany. We have different coalitions that have formed, and I think that feeds into the people's ability to engage in compromise. Of course, that is something you also find in the United States of America. What is true for all our political parties is a certain historical background, what was behind them being founded at the time. When you look to the Social Democrats, this goes way back, further back than is the case with the Christian Democrats. In a way, they were founded because people learned a lesson from history. The Social Democratic Party evolved as a consequence of industrialization, a party that stood up for the rights of the workforce. And the CDU drew the lessons from the National Socialists, where the Democrats were no longer able to build bridges between Protestants and Catholics. So we integrated that element of being able to build bridges into our party platform. But nevertheless, the description Ms. Adichie gave of what power is about, I like that, yeah? I think it's very apt. Are we still talking about topics when we refer to the present election campaigns? Is it still about topics? Ms. Adichie said power, well, of course it is about issues and topics. Well, when you look at the recent developments, do you really think that the issues were talked about in the party campaign? Well, whether it actually came to people discussing these matters is another thing, says the Chancellor. But politicians have to respond to the questions that they're being asked. And if they're not asked about these issues or problems, they cannot talk about it, unless you would want to shirk a question. But if you look at the election campaign of the political parties, there are a whole host of events where the topics that are of interest to the citizens are being discussed. When I look back to my own history, these election arenas, as it is called, where citizens are allowed to put questions to certain politicians. I think events like these are very important, a kind of town hall meeting, so to speak.
Between the perceived lack of topics in this election campaign we were just talking about and what you said about social media and the change of public discourse. And we would like to go a little bit deeper into that because you have your own experiences with that, and you also wrote a lot about it. And I would like to quote one of the phrases I found very, very impressive, because sometimes it appears that the more media channels people have at hand, the less they are able to really open up, discuss, and develop a tolerance for other opinions and stances. So you recently criticized the, I quote, social media savvy people who are choking on sanctimony and lacking in compassion. That's quite a statement. Would you like to point out a little bit more closely to us why you think this is happening?
Yes, I remember writing that in a fit of rage one night at like 3 a.m., having not slept very much. But no, I stand by it completely. I think, so this idea of choking on sanctimony and lacking compassion, I think that social media platforms, and again, I say this as somebody who recognizes how social media can be a good thing. And I like to use the example of, in Nigeria, the End SARS protest against police brutality, which happened recently, relatively. And young people organized on social media. So that protest would have been impossible without social media. And I think it was very impressive that it happened. But on the other hand, I think that social media platforms have become a place for people to sort of have this kind of performative, shallow discourse. You cannot actually have real conversations about things. And there's a lot of moralizing. And I also have to say that it seems to be much more common on the political left. And that's my tribe. My tribe is the political left. And it is my tribe that I am looking at with a kind of sort of side eye. There's a lot of moralizing. There's a lot of... there isn't the assumption of good faith when people in public discourse. And I think that's really troubling for the future of discourse. So I think a lot of people who participate in social media have become so afraid of saying the wrong thing, of saying it the wrong way, that they would rather not say anything. And there is this loudness in sanctimony and moralizing. And I wish that we could talk about ideas without necessarily moralizing. So for example, I don't think that, okay, I guess I could use climate change, for example. I think there's a lot of moralizing on that topic. I don't think, for example, that a person is morally bad because that person doesn't recycle, or that a person is morally good because that person recycles. I don't think that should be the premise of the conversation. I actually think that people just need to be enlightened and educated, and that the marketing needs to be better. Right? And I see a lot of discourse on climate change. The moralizing, I don't think, is very helpful. But this is true for many other subjects. And so that sanctimony, I think, is very off-putting. And we cannot assume, I mean, obviously the world is full of bad people, but we cannot assume bad faith starting out. We have to take the risk of assuming good faith in conversations. And so I, for example, again, as a member of the tribe of the political left, I seek out opinions that are not like mine. I subscribe to rightist. I mean, there's certain things I just will not read because they're ridiculous, but intelligent right, I will read. Reasonable right, I will read. So in the US, I'll read the Wall Street Journal and I'll read the Washington Post. And often I'll read the same subject in both papers because I want to know what the two different sort of views are. And it's also important because, you know, I think, of course, that my view is correct, but I need to know what the opposing view is because it better helps me, I think, to make sure that my own position makes sense. I don't think we're doing that enough now in the world, and I think that it benefits us to know what the other side thinks.
What you just described means a lot of effort. You have to put into really getting to know different views and comparing and making up your mind and building your own position. If that doesn't happen, we experience something that comes together in the term of cancel culture. I would like to turn it to the Chancellor, Frau Bundeskanzlerin. Können Sie mit dem Begriff der Cancel Culture was
anfangen? Do you understand the term cancel culture? Is that something you also experience in politics these days? Well, I think that this is a term that can be interpreted in many different ways. But what is important to me is to see every person in his or her complexity. You know, when you look to our constitution, the so-called basic law, it places the dignity of man in the center. It is inviolable. And sometimes it is neglected because people tend a very one-dimensional view of it, or see it defined in a very one-dimensional way. And this is what I like about Ms. Adichie's approach. She points to the fact that we are not one-dimensional and that we ought to be curious in learning more about other people, about what drives them, what inspires them, and what kind of baggage they bring with them. This presupposes that we are open we should be and have to be open. We should have our own convictions and beliefs. We should not oppose them at being absolute. We should always try to engage with others who may have different views and also try to put ourselves into their shoes, asking ourselves what makes him or her hold this particular view. And as a consequence, you can then have a genuine interchange and exchange of views, I believe. I think the danger we might run with respect to the communication via the social media, it is part and parcel of our reality, yes, indeed. But there is a certain dangerous aspect to it. The danger, the risk we might be running is that it is driven by clicks. Those who get many clicks, of those who create a stir, receive many clicks, and that is something people are interested in. And, well, generally speaking, bad news tend to get more attention, or seem to be more exciting, and seem to trigger a response more eagerly than the one video about the wonderful mission of the fire brigade or the technical relief agency. And we're talking people here who do a lot to see our society succeed. And then, as I said, people tend to look to bad news. We're not all exclusively good people. Sometimes we laugh if other people fail, as do other people when we fail. This has happened to me. This is okay, it's acceptable. But if you reduce life to this aspect, I think it would be good, because people want to also hear success stories. If you're exclusively confronted with the sum of failures, of things that haven't worked out, where people have not succeeded, I think it will be doing damage to your soul. So we have to strive for a good balance here, I believe. Madam Chancellor, Ms. Adichie has had her experiences with people taking her statements out of context and having reduced it in their meaning. Your critics, Madam Chancellor, have challenged you, saying that your refugee policy, especially the statement you made, we can do this at the time, has not led to an increasing division in our society and driven refugees into Germany. What is your response? Well, that I beg to differ. I don't agree with them. The statement I made at the time consists of two components. It's interesting, though, because it's a political statement, you know, when you look at the TV spots of myself and other politicians. Yes, we can. It's nothing special, you know. It was a given situation, and in that situation it was remarkable, if you so wish. I said, we can do this, because, and I just said why I believed we could do it, because I was quite aware of this being a major task we had to tackle, and I want to underline this, you know. Generally speaking, I think we can do this, yes, but at the time I thought one had to inject a sense of optimism into the matter. But that this would be triggering a political debate is obvious, and it's good, I believe, in a democracy, because at the end of the day, and that is what I find so fascinating about Mrs. Adichie, who lives in two worlds, in Nigeria and in the United States, you know. What is the reference system for our activities, for what we do these days, what we believe? In the old days, it was my village or my city. We didn't really travel the world. Then it was at a later stage our nation. With a country like Nigeria, it might be slightly different, because you have many ethnic groups with their own histories and their own cultures. And then for us it is Europe. When you look beyond the national border and we speak about globalization, I think these days it's anything but easy for people to, you know, given the sum of problems they're facing, to identify where they can engage, where they can commit themselves. And I think concerns and fears is what prey on the minds on the people, and we politicians have to try to find reasonable answers.
You witnessed Chancellor Merkel's refugee policy in 2015 and the following. what did you think about it?
Oh, I found it very inspiring. And I remember reading that she's said to have said, and I say this because I really hope she said it, because it's, you know, the media can say that people said things they did not say. But I remember reading that she said, I will not participate in a competition about who can treat the refugees the worst. And I just thought this kind of decision, you did say it.
More or less, yeah.
So I found that, and I think just the idea of standing on principle and saying that this is a country that really can afford to be humane and acting on it, I found it really inspiring. And I should say that I feel that, and this is not necessarily as a view that I think is considered sophisticated, but it's one I have, which is that I think that Europe has a moral responsibility for other parts of the world, especially parts of the world in which Europe meddled in the past. And so, you know, we can talk about Syria and what happened in Syria and you know, who enabled it and who didn't, but the fact remains that human beings are deserving of dignity because they are human beings. Right? And it shouldn't depend on what passport one carries, what color of skin one has, what religion one practices. Because we are human, we deserve dignity. And so I felt that she stood on that principle, and I really was inspired by it, particularly because I think it had potential political consequences for her, and because I think that she also understood that she would be dealing with a lot of resistance. And for me, that just is courage. And I admire courage.
Wenn ich vielleicht noch eins sagen darf, es gibt ja die Theorie, wenn man so etwas sagt, wir schaffen das, oder ein freundliches Wort über Flüchtlinge sagt, dass dann sofort alle hinhören auf der Welt und sagen, das ist eine Einladung zu kommen. Und das glaube ich
invitation to refugees, and I don't agree with them, because I think that people find it quite hard to be forced to leave their countries. And I do believe that basically we are called upon, of course we cannot invite or take in all the people that live under dire circumstances or are less well off where they are, but that the time brought home to us the truth, and that is, as far as Syria was concerned, we made a mistake. We did not take a look at what was happening in Jordan, we did not look at what had happened in Lebanon, that the people were no longer having enough to eat, that the children could no longer attend school, and we said we must not repeat that mistake. We have to be careful to look at movements of refugees in the neighborhood, in the vicinity, that is. In Germany, the vast majority of refugees go to Europe, and the vast majority are internal refugees, refugees that either stay within the country or go to the neighboring countries. And here again, I look to Africa. They flee to other countries on the African continent because they're fleeing from terrorism and similar attacks. Now, what does this mean? It means, you made the point, you rather mentioned Afghanistan, and of course that brings us back to Syria and to the Arab Spring. At the time,
Proteste von Menschen gab in Libyen, in
Ägypten, in Tunesien, in Syrien, Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Syria. At the time, we pursued a political approach that said we have to support these people who take to the streets to protest peacefully. We have to support them from the outside. But of course, we have to be very careful these days, because we know from the outside it is very difficult to, steer this or regulate it, and it's a difficult moral question. When I think of Rwanda and the genocide that happened there, and then people saying, well, how can you not interfere?
sehen,
then
was
on
will
the
die
one hand we
Bevölkerung
have to make
wirklich und
sure
wir dürfen auch
that we
keine
don't
falschen
automatically
Hoffnungen erwecken,
interfere.
dass
We
wir
have to
dann
be careful
sozusagen
not to
von
instill a
außen
false sense of hope in the people.
Demokratie, wie wir sie gewöhnt sind, dorthin bringen
We
können.
cannot, you know,
Diese
implant a
Gratwanderung, die
democracy
werden wir
as
noch
we've
besser
come
lernen müssen.
used to.
Das
It's a
ist nicht
delicate
einfach,
balancing act, and we'll have to learn our
wenn wir
lessons here. It's
global
anything
vernetzt
but
sind, wie wir es
easy.
ja sind,
We are
wenn wir
globally
voneinander wissen,
connected
und das
now.
hat sich durch die
We're
sozialen Medien ja
networked,
noch
as we all
mal sehr
know,
viel
and the
mehr
social media has
verbreitet,
given a
dass man viel
further
mehr
push to
voneinander
that.
wissen kann.
We know much more of what is
Dann
going on
müssen
in
wir
other
auch
parts of the
ganz
world and
offen
what the
sagen, was
experiences
können
of
wir
other
leisten
people
und
are.
was können
We
wir
have to
nicht
openly
leisten.
say what we are in a
Aber
position to do and what we are
2015
not in
war
a
so,
position
die
to.
Flüchtlinge
But at the
waren
time
auf
when I made that
europäischem Grund.
statement,
Und
these
die
refugees
standen
had
vor
already
unserer
arrived on
Tür.
European territory. They were
Und
on
jetzt
our
zu sagen, pass mal
doorstep.
auf,
And to
zurück
say,
übers
well, we're
Mittelmeer,
closing
das
the
war
door
für
into
mich
your
kein
faces
Weg. Ich habe dann
across
ja
the
auch das Abkommen
Mediterranean,
mit der
put them back
Türkei
on the
zum
boats.
Beispiel
No, that was
verhandelt,
unacceptable to
damit
me. I
vor Ort in
negotiated the
der Nähe
refugee agreement with
Syriens
Turkey in
Flüchtlinge
order to
versorgt werden konnten.
allow people to be taken in the vicinity to Libya. You said it's a delicate balancing act. It's, you know, of course, negotiating positions. You grew up in the former GDR. When you think back to your personal experience of the time, this ability to engage constructively, accepting that other parties may have different positions, what does this mean for you? Well, what does that have to do with the former GDR, if I may ask? Do you think we're less able to engage such a debate? No, simply because you said, you started by saying you grew up in the former GDR. Well, what made you say that? Well, because I was not able to freely express my views. Well, that is why I tend to be very sensitive when people try to silence people. You know, of course, everyone should have the right to freely speak his or her mind,
artikulieren können,
to
wenn es
articulate
nicht
their
sozusagen
views,
eine hassgepflasterte,
unless it is
also
fed
die Würde
by
des anderen
hatred
verletzende Botschaft
and not
ist. Aber in
respecting the
dem anderen
dignity
Rahmen
of
muss man sich
one's neighbor.
austauschen können.
But
Und,
you should be allowed to have your own view and to
ich
exchange
habe
views on
deshalb
that
so ein bisschen
basis.
geguckt,
You
weil
know, I was a bit
mich
taken
hat mal
aback
jemand
and looking
gefragt,
at you because someone once
sagen Sie
came
mal,
up to me and asked me,
naja, so eine
well,
richtige
say,
Frau, die Ostdeutsch ist, sind Sie ja auch
you know,
nicht
you're
mehr,
not a genuine
aber
East German
können Sie mir
any
mal
longer,
erklären,
are
wie
you?
es zu
But
den
perhaps you can
AfD-Wählern kommt? Also
explain
ich
to
habe keine
me
Lust,
how
Experte
the AfD
für
came about.
AfD-Wähler zu sein.
Well, I'm not the
weil ich
expert on
aus
the
der DDR
AfD for
komme. So, deshalb habe
for
ich Sie so
voters because I happen to come from the GDR. This is why I responded to you the way I responded to your question.
I think the reason that amused me in particular is that I kind of identified with it in a way because I often also have a kind of prickliness when I think that my Africanness is brought up when it's not necessary. Right? So obviously my Africanness is an identity that I love and would not change for anything, but often when you're in the West, that idea of Africa is so different and so unknowable, can make people say things like, oh, in Africa, do you drink water like everyone else? You know, that sort of thing, and Africa is brought up in ways, and so I too often get quite prickly about it, or when I think that my novels are read not as literature, but as some kind of anthropology, right? So I was quite amused by the question.
Yet another commonality. That is actually a good point, not to sort of refer to just one narrative. Well, Mrs. Adichie, let's stick to you and one of your most famous lines that I'm sure almost everyone here in the audience has heard, because it's famous, I would say, for its huge popular resonance. You claimed, again, in yet another very successful TED Talk, and then in a Beyoncé song and on T-shirts around the world, that, I quote, "We should all be feminists." Do you still stand by that?
Yes.
Has it changed at all? Has your appreciation of the term or what it actually stands for you personally, has that developed at all? Has it evolved?
Honestly, not really. So I should say that making the choice to come out as a feminist was intentional, and using that word feminist was also intentional. I mean, I understand how much that word historically has been loaded with all kinds of negative stereotypes, and how I think particularly in Europe, it has a politicized sort of element to it, where it's seen as a sort of almost like a political movement. And for me, really, feminism it's a belief system. And it's obviously it's a movement as well, but it's fueled by a belief system. And for me, it's a justice movement. It's fundamentally the belief that men and women are equal. We know that they are, but we live in a world that denies that they are. And so to be a feminist is to say that we acknowledge that they are, that we want to walk towards a world where women are no longer excluded. We've lived centuries of human civilization in which women have been oppressed, excluded, reduced to property, and all of those things. And it still happens in different ways. I don't think there is anywhere in the world where we have full equality between men and women. It manifests itself differently. So obviously, in a place like Afghanistan, it might seem much more dramatic, but in a place like Germany, it exists. And the fact, for example, that the stage has only women is remarkable. Why is it remarkable? If it were all men, it would not be remarkable, it would be normal. Mm-hmm. And I think that people who talk about this event might end up saying, oh, it was nice to see, it was all women. And I suppose, yes, it's nice to see, but I want a world where it's ordinary, where it's no longer remarkable. Mm-hmm.
Allerdings muss ich sagen, dass sich da doch was verändert hat.
But I have to say that something has changed as far as Germany is concerned, at least.
Also mir wäre das vor 20 Jahren
say 20 years ago, I wouldn't have noticed that much if there had only been men engaging in such a discussion. Today, I would find it unacceptable. I wouldn't think it would be okay. So something would be wrong, you know, something would be missing. So we've made a small step in the right direction, but we're still a far cry from equality. Perhaps we should stick for a moment with this. Yes, please. With the difficult term feminism, I remember a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, we met at the G20 women's meeting, and I asked you whether you would claim to be a feminist, and you took some time to think about it. You said you did not want to adorn yourself with borrowed plumes. Alice Schwarzer, Simone de Beauvoir, you said, had been fighting for something that you would not claim your achievement, and we had a very interesting discussion follow that statement on yours. In the face of what, or in the light of what Ms. Adichie just said, would you view it differently? Well, you know, for me, the term feminism is linked to a particular movement that stood up to fight for women's right and to place it on the global agenda. That is why I said I don't want to adorn myself with borrowed plumes. Queen Maxima from the Netherlands opened the door, so to speak, because she said basically it's about men and women being equal and should have an equal share in participating in our lives, in social life and general life. And as far as that is concerned, yes, I would rightly claim to be a feminist. I tried to make that point somewhat shyly at the time 5 years ago, and today I've given it more thought, and yes, in that sense I can say we should all be feminists.
Yay!
I want a world where male politicians will be asked this question and will answer as she's answered. I also just wanted to add that in talking about, for me, talking about how important it is that men and women be equal, it is not at all to say that men and women are the same. Because I think that often usually people who are not making arguments in good faith will say things like, oh, well, you know, you women want to be men, so, you know, people will say things like that. And I think it's important to say that asking for equality is not the same as denying that men and women are different. In fact, it isn't the differences between men and women that's the reason for sexism. If women were not, in general, physically weaker, and if women were not, in general, the ones who do the domestic work, and most of all, who have been blessed and burdened with possible reproductive function. In other words, women have the babies. And because women have the babies, there are real consequences for women's lives. And that has been the case really throughout the time of human civilization. And so I think when we talk about equality, it's important to recognize, for example, that we need to talk about women and what women need in the workplace, what those specific needs to women, which do not apply to men. Mm-hmm. And I say that because, so I come from a country where women who go in to be interviewed for jobs are often asked things like, are you planning to get married anytime soon? And it's a question that is loaded because they're watching her and thinking she's probably going to get pregnant, and we don't want that. And I think that it's important to protect women in that way. It doesn't apply to men, but there's some men who will say to you, well, since you want equality, we have to be treated the same. But that's not, so I guess my point is we need to recognize the differences. And when we talk about equality, we cannot treat people who are not equal as though they are equal. We have to make them equal.
Yes, the belief system.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Ms. Adichie, you have not only been very vocal as a feminist, you've also been really vocal about your distinguished love of fashion. And you have been very vocal about the fact that you really prefer wearing Nigerian-made clothes, as we can see, which is stunning. You call this fashion nationalism. What stands behind that term for you?
Who told you this is Nigerian? This is from Düsseldorf. I hear Düsseldorf is the fashion capital of Germany.
It is actually.
So happy to be here. No, this actually, this is actually, I should say, this is, I wanted to wear this. This is actually my mother's old George wrapper that for many years my mother owned. And so traditionally it's tied around the waist and then you wear a blouse with it. And I took it and I repurposed it and turned it into a dress. And my mother's been gone just a few months, and I wanted to wear it because she would have been very happy for me to be here. She really admired Chancellor Merkel. And I remember watching one of the G8 meetings with her. And, you know, when they do the photo call and there were all these men and then there was Chancellor Merkel, and my mother said, she's the one holding all of those things together. And obviously, my mother was the first woman to be registrar at the University of Nigeria, where I grew up, and so she was also in many ways a woman who opened doors and who, you know, in some ways sort of broke boundaries. And yeah, so I wanted to wear, it was important for me, it sort of has real emotional significance for me, this one. But in general, fashion nationalism, I think I just wanted to, well, first of all, I think I just coined that expression. I think I was just trying to sound profound. But it really is that I think there's a lot of talent in Nigeria, and I think I'm fortunate to have a platform that's international, and I just wanted to use that platform to showcase Nigerian talent. I mean, there's just, Nigerians, we have it.
Frau Bundeskanzlerin, wie steht es denn mit dem deutschen Modenationalismus bei Ihnen?
Madam Chancellor, how about German fashion nationalism?
Also ich finde das erstmal total richtig.
Well, I think that this is totally right. My outfit, as we say these days, I think is very German and very predictable, though I love colors. And I think that that is something that you also find in many African countries, the love for colors. And the happiness to display it. When you look at the spouses of French presidents, they showcase French fashion and designers. Michelle Obama also made a point of supporting young designers, African designers, and I think that that is right and that it is good. Mrs. Adichie said she doesn't always want to see her novels be understood as a kind of compass and of anthropological nature, you know. The thing is, Ms. Adichie, we know so little about the different cultures of different African countries. We know so little. We are not knowledgeable at all, and sometimes we hide it by not asking curiously about these things. Anyone who has ever looked closer at the ethnic groups in Africa, I'm far from being an expert, but if you take a look at what the colonial powers did at the time at the end of the 19th century, the borders they arbitrarily drew, and then people said, well, my uncles and aunts, they live in Niger, but I am from Mali. Then there are parts where I have of the country where I have no relatives at all, because the borders were drawn arbitrarily. So these are all factors that make nation building on the African continent more difficult. We have to show show greater interest. And if you do that, you discover something new. And I think fashion can be a good starting point for people engaging in that discussion, asking what kind of dress do you wear? What do we have in common? Where do we differ?
Yeah, I just want to say, I do agree very much with them. And I think it's such an important point about how often we're not knowledgeable, but we hide it. And I think in some ways it's connected to what we talked about earlier, that we now live in a world where we're so careful about getting things wrong that we just choose not to talk. And I think it's just, it's dangerous for us as a species. I actually sometimes find myself thinking that we seem to be participating in our own decline as a vibrant human community. I'm very much a believer in asking questions and in curiosity. I think of myself as a student of life and for life. And I think maybe the reason that people like me who are from, parts of the world that are not considered powerful economically or politically is that it's very easy for condescension to become part of the conversation. And that's why the question isn't whether one should ask questions. People should. But I think it's how the questions are asked. And I also think that most Africans are emotionally intelligent enough to know when a question is coming from a good place and when a question is paternalistic nonsense. And I'm a very keen supporter of asking questions. I think it's important. If we do not ask questions, if we do not show curiosity, we cannot learn about one another. And if we don't, we just don't progress as a human species. So I don't mind being asked about whatever about Nigeria. It depends on how. So when I talk about my novels being read as only anthropology, it's often, for example, being told that a father character represents the repression in Nigeria's military dictatorship, which goes back to the pre-colonial construction of, and I'm thinking, no, it's just a father character. Right? And so, but on the other hand, I do believe in learning from literature. Actually, I learn from literature. I learn from reading about different parts of the world. When I went to the US, the reason that I started to understand America was because I started to read all kinds of novels about America. When I was growing up, the reason that the world for me became familiar was because I read novels about the world. And often when I'm going to a new country, I don't only read, usually I'll try and read a bit of nonfiction about its history, but I usually want to read a novel because it gets me to see what the texture of life is like in those countries.
Mm-hmm. Could you, Ms. Adichie, once explain to us, we touched upon the danger of a single story in the course of this conversation several times, but when you had that thought and you prepared that talk, what was the single story? Was it related to what you were just talking about regarding your life?
Honestly, I don't know. I just remember being so terrified that I had been asked to give the TED Talk, and I had no idea what the hell to talk about. And everybody was, I went and looked at past TED Talks, and people had talked about how they built schools and built wells in the desert, and I thought, my God, I haven't done anything. And so the one thing that I remember thinking that I deeply cared about was this idea that we cannot reduce people to single things. I think it came from my own experience, going to the US and realizing how little my American contemporaries knew about the world that I came from. And so how before they saw me, they felt pity for me. And I just thought, what? Right? And I realized very quickly how they had reduced me to this stereotype of Africa, a place where, a place that commands your pity, but never your respect. And I also realized that I was guilty of it. So actually, I remember when I went to Mexico for the first time and how I was surprised to see that Mexico was a vibrant place full of all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. And I felt so ashamed of myself because I had come from America where Mexico was portrayed as this single thing of just the most abject immigrants. And I had bought into that without realizing it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was sort of, if I had an aha moment that led to that TED Talk, it was when I was in Guadalajara. Mm-hmm. And it was the shame I felt. And I thought, my God, why am I surprised? Mm-hmm. And so later, when I was thinking about the TED Talk, it was kind of what inspired it, which was sort of my way of saying, everyone else beware, don't do what I did.
So it was actually you reducing, in a way, some people to at least one story that you had heard.
Oh, yes, yes. Yeah. Sadly. I'm working hard on it now.
Frau Bundeskanzlerin, bei Ihnen fallen einem ja durchaus auch einige Geschichten ein, einige...
Madam Chancellor, can you also think of some stories from your own life? You very frequently were the first woman in an office. What story left your mark on you? We don't want to go back to a single story today, but what would you say was the story that left a mark on you?
Naja, mich hat...
Well...
glaube ich, geprägt, dass ich manche Diskussionen,
I've been characterized and influenced.
Well,
what story influenced me? Many things did, you know, the fact that I worked with mentally disabled children, grew up with them as a child and thus had no fears of engaging with them. The fact that I studied physics, I think, has influenced me, undoubtedly, because in the former GDR, that was something that could not be negatively influenced, you know. Mass is always mass, it's always the same thing in socialism or in a democracy, but in the former Federal Republic, I would probably not have studied physics, but I studied a subject where 70 or 80 or 90% of the students were men, so I was amongst a group where women tended to be a minority during my studies. And I think the fact that I'd always been under the impression that we were tackling matters in a different way when it came to experimenting, or my fellow students, we can't say men in general or women in general, but those I studied with, they started immediately, set about tackling the task, not often being successful in doing so, whereas I sat and thought first and looked first. But then, although all the tables were occupied when I had finished looking on, and so I had to find a different approach, go and reserve a space first. So that is my way of approaching matters, and I think that that has influenced me. And I think at the time, certain subjects were taught separately, women and men. These are all things that left a mark on me. Was there one narrative that you have rejected right from the outset? Well, I think I was influenced by the fact that I come from a family that was open. My house, my parents' house was an open house. Different thoughts, different ideas were discussed. No one was not invited into our house. My father was a priest. But what's your question? I think I responded to the wrong question. Well, pluralism amongst your parents in your home, yes. Has there been anything that you have rejected outright as a kind of narrative? Well, the response, my statement, we can do it, we can do this, received, you know. Reports were circulating that I'd only pursued this approach towards refugees because I wanted to become Secretary General of the United Nations and had to treat certain countries nicely because I needed their votes. That was absolute rubbish. Invention. Fake news. I experienced that too. Over time, you have visited Africa time again. You visited Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. South Africa, yes, recently again to South Africa, very often focusing on the root causes of flight and refugees. So many of the topics we already touched upon. The media have repeatedly said that Africa was a continent that will define your legacy. Is that something that they invented at the time, or does it contain a grain of truth? No, Africa is fascinating. I find Africa fascinating. I'm fascinated by Africa. It is, you know, as if someone coming from America were to say, you come from Europe. Africa is so different from us. We're talking 54 different countries with their own traditions, but I'm fascinated by the fact that it is such a young continent. When you look to the average age of the population here in in Germany it's 46 or 47, 45 years. Many African countries have an average age of their population of 15 or 18 or 19. And that means that you have the demanding youth very often being disappointed in seeing their desires not being fulfilled, but it is a young spirit. I'll never forget, you know, I was awarded a broadcasting prize where people reported about a migrant from Ethiopia who called his mother on the phone and said, "Mummy, you could sit on a bench in the park, no one would call you old because they all look like you here." And you know, yes, I am very curious to know more and to learn more about the African continent. And it saddens me sometimes that they are so, that the countries who have sufficient growth on the African countries are so few. When you look at the events in Libya, which triggers an enormous wave of terrorism in a number of African countries, it's a continent that faces many problems, but then again, well, the countries on the African continent have enormous potential. This is why I started that initiative within the G20, the Compact with Africa, as we called it, you know, because I insisted on it being Compact with Africa. Very often we tend to do something for Africa, but Africa doesn't need us. Africa has its own plans, its own agenda, 2060. And, you know, they don't want someone to come up and to lecture them, say, don't commit that mistake, we've made it. But the countries of the African continent have the right and are entitled to pursue their own path. And I find that fascinating.
Is that something you can relate to, or could you embellish on that in a way that you tell us how you perceive the Western initiatives? What do they right and what do they in the wrong way?
Oh, we don't have the time for me to tell you my thoughts about that. Actually, but I'm thinking about, you know, I think the question about her visits to African countries, and I think the kind of framing was about Africa as the needy continent, which in some ways is true. But actually, I wanted to ask Madam Chancellor about her visit to Nigeria and her, I remember in 2019, our president, there was a lot of sort of excitement because we were told that there had been a memorandum of understanding with the German company. Is it pronounced Siemens or Siemens?
Siemens.
Yeah. Siemens. Yeah. And so we were told that Siemens had done this miraculous work in Egypt and in Afghanistan, I think, and maybe in Iran, I think, with electricity, and that Siemens would then fix electricity problem, which has been the bane of Nigeria really since independence, electricity. And we were told that this had the full backing of Chancellor Merkel and the German government, and we were all very excited. And it's 2 years later, and nothing has happened. And so I wanted to know if you know about it. Of course, not holding you responsible for Siemens, but really it was, I mean, we were told that the German government had made this happen. So I'm just wondering why we still don't have improved electricity.
Ja. Okay, also ich nehme das mal zum Anlass nachzufragen.
Well, I'll make a point of going back and asking Siemens what happened. There are several reasons. One of the reasons is that there were problems to do with funding. Very often when investments are supposed to take place, people ask about what ways of financing are available, and we made a mistake a couple of years ago because people said that the minute you appear with your companies and you don't provide the right financing, that you will easily get the job. The Chinese always have that financing aspect dealt with. So we also make it part of our approach these days. It might well be at the time, as was the case with the project in Ghana, that the Nigerian state or government rather demanded too much local content. You know, when you have a German investor saying, I want to engage in the electricity production in Africa, in Nigeria or Ghana, but I want to have, and then the government says that 50% of this is local content. It's been produced in the country. Generally speaking, think that is the right approach, but very often the projects fail as a consequence when you speak about solar panels or gas-powered plants. And you start by zero, and there is no industrial basis in the country. To start with 40 or 50% local content, such a project can easily flounder. As I said, I'll go back and try to... Where was this electricity project to take place? In Lagos? Do you remember? Where was it to be set up?
No, I don't think we were told where exactly, but I think we were told how many megawatts and that it would be done in, I think it was supposed to sort of increase by, I don't know, something like 7,000 in 1 year, and then in 2 years it was supposed to go to 15,000.
Sie kriegen eine Nachricht.
I will get back to you. You will get your answer.
Thank you.
Haben wir noch einen schönen Berührungspunkt.
Another nice point we have in common. You know, I was very happy to be in Nigeria. I would have loved to be able to spend more time in the country and to learn more about it. The thing about travels to Africa, to the African continent, is that people tend to underestimate the enormous distances they have to cover. We are talking enormous distances from east to west and from the south to the north. Of course, Nigeria in itself is a giant country, a large country, with many different ethnic groups. And I don't think you can claim that you've been in Nigeria if you haven't been to Lagos, where life is pulsating in Lagos, that is.
Ist das richtig?
Am I right?
Yes. And I think that if you you might have a bit more free time in a few weeks, so please come to Lagos.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it might well be that I will then visit African countries. Yeah, indeed. You know, it's really interesting to say that people might not be aware of that. Over decades, German politicians tended to visit East Africa and, of course, South Africa, but the West African part of the continent has been somewhat neglected. Many countries there used to be under French rule, colonized by the French, where thus French-speaking, not Ghana and Nigeria, of course, but as a consequence, German federal chancellors hardly ever paid a visit. I think there are countries that never had a German chancellor visit before I paid a visit. And we've slowly started to focus on this French-speaking part of the African continent. But then again, you have many different countries there to visit and to work with and to get to know. As I said, 54 countries. The European Union is difficult, and you have 27 member states. African continent has 54.
In Lagos, between the two of you, I think there's an invitation from
Yes, yes, absolutely. Oh, it'd be...
Wenn Frau Adichie mich empfängt.
Yes, if you were to receive me, I would be happy to come.
Wonderful. It's done.
Ms. Adichie, talking about Nigeria, which is very close to your heart, let's talk about something else that's very close to your heart. Today is kind of a special day because it's the publication of the German version of your most recent book, Notes on Grief. The German title is Trauer ist das Glück, geliebt zu haben, which is quite a beautiful translation. And the piece is stunning. The text is a really stunning description of your grief, very unfortunately, because you have recently lost both of your parents. And this happened during a year of social distancing and physical separation. So I'm wondering, how have you been able to experience this really profound grief of losing them so close to each other in a time of isolation, of global isolation?
I don't know. I don't know how people ask me how I'm coping, and I honestly just... And sometimes people have said, you're strong. And I think, actually, no. I think part of grief is pretending. You learn the art of pretense. Mm-hmm. And you kind of just keep going because you have to. And I was very close to my parents. I had just the loveliest parents. And when my father died last June, it was in the middle of lockdown. I was in the US. My parents were in Nigeria. My father died in my ancestral hometown. And not being able to travel because the Nigerian airports were closed was very difficult. I think there's something about loss that your first reaction is disbelief. And so even though on a Zoom call with my siblings, my brother Oki was there with my father when he died, I saw my father's body on the screen, but it still felt unreal. And the fact that I could not travel, and even the fact that the roads outside my American home were utterly silent, it just made it all even more surreal. And so I would wake up in the morning and think, wait, did it actually happen? You know, Daddy actually died? And then finally, when I was able to travel and I went back home, just the fact that the world had changed, that, you know, there were new rules for funerals, that everything had changed was, I don't know, it made that constant disbelief that is part of grief, it made it even more, it heightened it. And then my mother died in March. My mother died on my father's birthday, which just felt like a very bad plot twist in a very bad novel. And my parents had been very close and had a wonderful friendship. And so when my mother died, I was in Nigeria. She was in Nigeria as well. So it didn't, that sense of the surreal was there, but I think in some ways, because the distance was less, it wasn't quite as surreal. Instead, it was just the most horrible, direct pain. You know, I just thought, what the...
So taking the German title, which is a beautiful quote actually from one of your novels as well, which is in full, grief is the celebration of love. Those who could feel real grief were lucky to have loved. What have you learned in the last few months about this feeling of lack of love while also suffering, actually?
I remember when I wrote that in a novel, but then of course I hadn't experienced real grief. But I still think that grief is about love. And I still hope to get to a point where all I will feel is gratitude to have loved. I'm not there yet. I still feel real angry about losing my parents the way that it happened. But I do think that when you really think about it, grief is love. Grief is love. If you haven't loved, then you cannot grieve. And yeah, and I'm learning and trying.
Frau Bundeskanzlerin, Sie haben auch einen Verlust erlitten. Sie haben,
Madam Chancellor, you've also suffered a loss. Your mother passed away in 2019. Can you relate to this description of grief, that grief is an expression of love, to have loved?
Yeah, sure. Of course. I think only if you've loved someone, can you feel grief at his or her death? Because that's the response to him or her not longer being available, no longer being there for you to talk to. And once this is translated into German, I'll be more than happy to read this book. You know, I was in the situation that I was able to attend the burials of my parents and that I was not very far away when they died, but nevertheless you have to bid farewell. Yes, indeed, I can. Yeah, I very much agree with what you said. Grief is the celebration of love. When you look to the position you hold as a politician, there is so little room for privacy. Was that a very difficult situation for thee at the time? Well, of course, it is a difficult situation. As you say, it is something that is very private indeed, and then people look at you, wondering, can you see any traces in her face? I found that pretty hard, but it's part and parcel of the job. It comes with the job, you know. You have to create your own sphere. And, you know, as I've always made sure that I had a certain sphere where I didn't allow anyone in that did not belong there. It was possible. 3 days after your parents have died, if you then have to address Parliament and to deliver a policy statement before Parliament, you can't just say, I can't, I won't be available. But then again, there are many people who have shown understanding and have understood that you need a moment for yourself.
Relate as a person also, at least a public person, of course, Chancellor Merkel has even higher demand, public demand certainly, but can you relate to that need for really creating a space that is entirely yours for this kind of mourning?
Yes, and also in some ways the reverse, which is that for me, this process of grieving has been a learning experience because grief hasn't quite been what I imagined it would be. I thought it would be this just steady sadness in which I would curl into myself and never want to come out. But actually, I've sometimes found it comforting to not be private about my grief. And the only time, for example, that I have read comments on social media is when I put up posts about my father when he died and my mother when she died. And I spent a day in bed crying endlessly because I was reading comments that people had written, and I was so moved by the kindness of strangers and by people who had shared their own stories of grief, which somehow gave me comfort and strength, and people who just seemed to understand what it felt like. And so, in a way, my act of public grieving, putting up information about having lost my parents, I felt really brought back to me a lot of good. I felt after my hours of crying in bed, I felt lighter. And I was grateful for it.
Simply to make the point, you know, when I said you have to create a certain sphere, I did not want to say that one would not engage with others, talk about this with them. Of course, you talk to people who you know. When your mother died, above all, there are many, many tribes and peoples in the world that consider that a very, very dire loss, a severe loss. Many colleagues of mine, counterparts, sent letters to me, moving letters, but you need your own space to tackle this. And political life, political activities is not that place. Madam Chancellor, after the 26th of September, you will probably leave office at some time. You will be the first federal chancellor, including male chancellors, logically, that will have freely decided to step down. That is a special kind of autonomy. What is the importance of that autonomy for you? Well, I was fortunate enough to have been elected to office 4 times, being able to form a government 4 times. For me, it was clear that I was coming to the end of that part of my life and that the country needed something new, something fresh for the country and the people. It is a very special experience, of course, to know that you have to focus today and tomorrow all day long. And in Germany, we're different from America. You don't have the exact date on which you hand over office. In Germany, it's different. Once elections have taken place on the 26th of September, it might well take a while for the German parliament to come together. It might be a quick development, or it might take another 2 months or so, and that is provided for by our constitution. And every day that I will continue as acting chancellor, I have to show full attention because many things are happening at the same time. And then it is one day, and then all of a sudden another day will happen. So, on the one hand, everybody says, well, we won't be seeing you very long now. This might be your last speech. This might not be the last time you attend this or that. That is one aspect. But the other aspect might be, all of a sudden, the troops withdraw from Afghanistan. We have an apocalyptic flood in Germany. All of a sudden, something happens, and nobody, you know, asks you whether this is 100 days before you step down or whether, you know, I have sworn an oath, and I feel committed to that, just as I did on the first day I took office as Chancellor. Just briefly to stay with this subject of handing over, which will come sometime soon. You were asked what you wanted to do right after in America, and you said, and I quote, "I will try to read a bit. I will probably fall asleep because I'm tired. I will sleep for a while and then wait and see where I appear." I think it's a super plan for the first few weeks and months, but I'd really like to hear from you what your narrative is like for the period after, for your future. What kind of narrative do you want to write for the next few years? Honestly, I don't have a narrative. People always assume But, you know, I live in the future, I live in the present. I think we should all focus more on living in the present. Some live in the past exclusively, and others focus exclusively on predicting the future and then miss out on being present in the present.
Wenn man eigentlich immer schon einen Tag weiter ist.
You know, you can't experience the present if you always think a day ahead. No, seriously, on a more serious note, I engaged as a politician at the beginning of the 90s, at the end of the 80s, and ever since my life has developed in an incredible manner, in a fascinating manner. I've never ever had a single normal working day since. I've always been challenged in political terms. And in a way, I stopped thinking about what I would be interested in apart from politics, or interested in most. And I've reached the age of 67, so it's not as if I had many, many years to come. So what I want to do with the time left to me is, of course, consider carefully what I would perhaps, you know, sense I would like to do. Do I want to write? Do I want to go out hiking or walking in nature? You know, this is why I said I'll wait and listen to myself and see what comes up. And I think that that is fascinating, a thing. You know, it's not as if I had set myself a particular task. Of course, I will receive invitations, but if I start creating another agenda because I'm afraid of a vacuum opening up, I don't want to do that, you know. Well, you've been invited to Lagos. Well, that is hewn in stone, but I'm not in a position yet to say when I will be able to visit.
In the present is reading literature, or of course also writing literature. If we read more, would this be a nicer, a more peaceful, a more tolerant world?
Yes.
Thank you. That's a very precise answer.
No, but I do think it's true, and I don't say that just because this happens to be, you know, my world, that literature happens to be what I do. I really do think that if we read more literature, and I should say that reading in general is fantastic, but it does matter what one reads. And I think it also matters how one reads. So when I say read, I don't mean read text messages or read tweets. I mean read something that is continuously long and makes sense and is properly punctuated. And has good grammar, and often this means, you know, novels and, you know, literary writing. And I think what I've noticed in just meeting people is that in general, people who read just seem to be, I think, more. No, I shouldn't say that actually, because there are people who do not read who have that. But I think reading literature is more likely to make you have a sense of empathy. Because it introduces you to a kind of complexity about human nature. And empathy helps us, I think. I think we need more empathy in the world. Yeah.
Frau Bundeskanzlerin, haben Sie auch eine Frage an Frau Adichie?
Madam Chancellor, would you like to put a question to Ms. Adichie? You've got the chance, final chance.
Ich würde jetzt, weil Sie gerade über das Lesen gesprochen haben.
Because you mentioned reading, literature. I think reading inspires one's imagination. You have to listen to something that has been written down, but you have to invest more imagination than if you were to watch a film, because much has already been addressed by the people who made the film. I'm a bit concerned, and this is perhaps why I would like to ask the following question. I'm a bit concerned whether the ability to read is not something that we are slowly losing. These days, people want to explain things by making a video about it or a film about it, you know. You know, when I learned how to bake a cake, I looked to a cookbook. Today, you watch a video that instructs you how to bake a cake. Are you equally concerned about mankind's ability to actually read?
Yes, I'm actually very concerned about it. But I think we can live in a world with both. In other words, I think we can watch videos of Rezo, yes. Yeah. I think we can watch videos of Rezo and also read...
Rezo?
Yes.
The young person who makes the exciting videos about politics.
Yes.
Exciting.
Die Zerstörung der
CDU. Tief in die deutsche Parteiengeschichte.
Well, you know a lot about Germany's party history, indeed.
Oh, I'm very interested. I'm interested in Germany. I find Germany fascinating, in good and bad ways. But could I just say, but yes, I am concerned about reading, and actually I really worry about it because I think we increasingly have short attention spans, and maybe it's because of technology and things being quick and fast. And I personally am not a fan of videos. I mean, I think I can see the usefulness in them, but often they slow me down, if that makes sense. Like, I want to read so I can decide my own pace. But the video kind of forces you to follow it. And often I find also that there's a shallowness to getting information from videos. I would rather read. Reading gives you more opportunity for depth. But I think because young people, there's a generation that's growing up with, sort of audiobooks. And my publisher is here, so I don't want to... audiobooks are fantastic, however, I still really think there's a difference. And I cannot do audiobooks. I just can't. Because I think certain things need to be read. The way that I think our brains function when we read is quite different from when we listen. And maybe some things work for listening, but I think some things should be read. And so I guess my point is, let's just try and read more, like proper books, not tweets and things.
Aber jetzt muss ich gleich noch eine Frage hinterstellen. Frau Adichie hat nämlich gesagt, sie...
A question, if I may add to that. You said you think Germany is pretty relaxed with its positive and negative sides. What are the positive aspects of Germany and the negative ones? Give me one example of each, please.
Okay. How much time do we have? No. All right, maybe I should be polite and start with the positive. Positive thing about Germany is, and maybe this is stereotypical, just how terribly organized things are. And so I came from Lagos, which I think is fair to say is not the standard for organization. And I love Lagos, by the way, I should say, but just arriving from Lagos and getting into Germany, I thought, my God, things work, right? I mean, this place is so bloody organized. And I admire that. Negative, so I was told, for example, how Germans came out in protest when George Floyd was murdered in the US, and how this seemed to really touch many Germans. And I thought that was lovely and very moving, that Germans were standing up for racism. But it made me think how in this country, and I think in many other Western European countries, anti-black racism is often framed as an American problem. And it seems to me that that's an American problem, but what about that problem in your own backyard? So in other words, what is the situation of black Germans in Germany? And the reason that I find that to be a negative thing is that about 2 years ago when I came to Germany and I was in Berlin, and I had a conversation about my novel, Americana, which is, among other things, about blackness in America and racism. And I asked a question about black Germans, and I said, what is it like? How do you talk about race? And I was told, oh, we don't talk about race because there isn't a word for race, because that word harkens back to the Nazi era, so we cannot talk about race. And I thought, but that's such a strange thing, because obviously I understand how important it is to be, and I think Germany seems to be, acknowledging its history and being careful about it, but there are black Germans whose lives are affected by being black Germans. And if they do not have the language to talk about that reality, then it's a problem. So that's the negative. I guess if there is a question, it is how...
Ja, also dahinter steckt etwas... Niemand würde sagen, es gibt
Well, of course, no one would say there is no racism in Germany, or would claim that there is no racism in Germany, but the term race is a term that people consider wrong as a word, because it insinuates for us that people are belonging to different races, that there are enormous differences between individuals. And we don't want people to think that there is race A, race B, or C, but this is not to say that there is no racism in Germany. During my political life, I spoke a lot about integration. And I realized at a time that equal participation of someone who looks different per se from the majority of people here is black instead of white, for example, is an enormous impediment for integration, because people tend to look at this person or to look at someone who comes from Turkey. You read his or her name and people look at you and you see the film that goes running behind their eyes. You know, people realize he's different or think he or she is different, and that it is enormously difficult to, how shall I put it, to be able to integrate. Well, how long do you have to integrate? We're talking the fifth or the sixth generation. Does it end once you've acquired German citizenship? But it's something in the minds of the people. It doesn't stop, you know. It is like a film that you see reeling down. Simply to explain to you, because of National Socialism, the term race, because the Jews were murdered because they were conceived or seen to belong to different race, and people said these are people that don't have the same value. Their life doesn't have the same value because they belong to different race. But we still talk about racism in Germany.
The problem is, you know, that our constitution, the basic law, contains the term race. The fathers and mothers of our basic law, of our constitution, said that no one must be discriminated against, and race is being one of the reasons given, or one of the, you're not meant to be discriminated against because of your race, and so on and so forth. So race is contained there as a term, and you can't easily replace it. But we want to erase it, basically, from the constitution, because it harks back to the National Socialists. But we have to, I think, continue to discuss this when I come and visit Lagos. It's a very sensitive topic.
Okay, we'll keep it for Lagos then.
So, for reasons of fairness, Ms. Adichie, do you have one last question to the Chancellor?
I have many questions. Okay, I'll think about one. So Hillary Clinton once described you as the woman who carries Europe on her shoulders. And did you know that she described you that way? Well, she did. And so when I read that, I remember thinking, so when has it felt heaviest? So in all of the years that you've been, when has that weight felt the heaviest?
Am schwersten war es in der Euro-Krise.
I think it felt heaviest during the Euro crisis, when, from the point of view of many, the demands made of Greece were severe, but many people did not want us to assist Greece, but we gave assistance to Greece because I thought we can't have one single government if we don't have a kind of similar economic structure. But it is tremendously difficult when you see that people were forced to suffer hardship, you know, that it was imposed upon them to a way. They had to suffer quite severe consequences. Unemployment was high, people had less income because taxes were increased. Public servants lost their jobs because we said at the time the administration had to be reformed. And then to have to explain this to the people, and then people being there, watching the demonstrators, seeing them suffer, being described as the evil woman who forced this upon Greece. Those years were difficult.
So, I think that was yes, please, if you want to.
Just a quick. So, when has it brought joy, that weight on your shoulders?
Sehr oft.
Very often indeed. Whenever we were able to find a compromise, I was really feeling great joy. You know, at the time I became Federal Chancellor, the Constitutional Treaty, which forms the constitutional basis for Europe. 2 referenda in the Netherlands and France had failed, and we had to design draft a new constitutional treaty. So we'd done all the preparatory work for the Lisbon Treaty of today, and that was a tremendous feeling of joy, you know, in having been successful in doing so. And then that we've been able to agree on the recovery fund in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. When we negotiated that, it took 2 days or 2 nights or 3 days and 2 nights, but we made it. We succeeded in getting it done. That is a tremendous feeling. Yeah, you're filled with joy that you've succeeded in getting all of that together.
Yeah.
So this was a real conversation.
Die durchaus unterschiedliche
A conversation with different positions,
aber sie waren beide sehr offen
but you were both very open for compromise, for the opinion of others. It was very exciting to listen to you. Thank you very much, Madam Chancellor, Mrs. Adichie. We would like to end on a quote from The Danger of a Single Story, where Ms. Adichie writes
that there is never a single story about any place. We regain a kind of paradise.
Und in diesem Sinne dieses Paradieses hier möchten wir auch Ihnen, meine Damen und Herren, herzlich danken für Ihre
Aufmerksamkeit. And in this sense of finding a kind of paradise, we would like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here for this beautiful evening, and thank you very much again to our 2 guests tonight. Wish you a very pleasant evening.
Dankeschön im Publikum.
And thank you to the audience.